Hi, hello. I hope you're taking care of yourself. If you're new here, my name is Lexi, and today we're going to be talking about all of the super cool books that I read in both May and June of this year. Fair warning, this is a very hit or miss wrap up. There are lots of bangers, and then there are lots of not bangers. I have been moving into my apartment for the last couple of months, so I didn't read a massive amount in May. I only got through 6 books, and then I got through 11 in June. So not bad, especially this last month, but we're still kind of trying to get back up to what I read when I'm not going through absolute crisis. I feel like I have this never-ending to-do list now inside of my head, even though I signed my lease like a month and a half ago. You would think that I would be done by now, but apparently not. But because of this stress, with books, I mostly went for things that were comforting and fun. So it's been a bit chaotic during this time. If this is your first rodeo on my channel, I do my wrap-ups mostly chronologically, and I don't say anything inside of them that I would consider to be a spoiler. I'll tell you the general premise of the book, I'll give you my thoughts, feelings, and emotions, obviously, but I try to keep it pretty vague in the specifics because the goal is that I want you to read these books if I think that they're good. So I'm not gonna spoil them. That would be stupid. With that, the first book I read was Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. I actually read all 3 of this series, the Regency fairy tale series, in a blind struggle for dopamine at the beginning of May. But this first book is about a girl named Dora, who, when she was a kid, she had half of her soul taken away by a fairy because of a deal that he made with her mother. And as a result of that, Dora realizes as she ages that she doesn't really feel in the moment emotions particularly intensely. She has a kind of weird affect. She finds most people to be annoying or stupid, and she definitely does not fit into 1800s Regency era England, which is where this book takes place. So her guardians kind of just assume that she will be forever unwed and like die a spinster or whatever. But everything changes when her cousin and her only friend Vanessa, she goes out to London to like do the season and see the gentlemen out there as you do. And Dora goes with her and they meet Lord Elias Wilder, who is this like angry, antisocial, leftist magician who also hates Regency era society but doesn't really know what to do about that other than just be bitter and banter a lot. And while Vanessa is out there kind of doing the society thing, Elias and Dora are investigating this like mysterious disease that's going around in the slums of England. I actually ate this like all the way up. I thought it was delightful. It was everything that I wanted it to be and so much more. The main character, Dora, to me reads as like extremely obvious neurodivergent rep, and I just found her to be like deeply relatable in a way that made me kind of uncomfortable. And just watching my girl find love with the grumpiest magician in the West, you could call it personalized wish fulfillment. You would not be like completely right, but you would definitely be more right than I'm okay with admitting online. The romance in this book is by far the best part. The banter, the vibes, sublime. I feel like I get it now. I get why people like historical romance. This is the first one that I've ever enjoyed. But when my man says things like, I have known many human beings with a full soul to their name who do not have half so much compassion or practicality as you. On a poor day, I might assume this to be a kind of indictment of the human soul. But today, I believe that you might simply have an overabundance of both qualities. He met Dora's eyes, and she felt his warmth seep into her soul, like a balm around its ragged edges. In short, though I am terrible at saying it, I'm glad that you are here. And then when he spins her around at the ball and he says, I did not come here only to dance. I came here only to dance with you. It is quite a different thing. Like, I get it. I see the bigger picture. I can understand why people spend their lives chasing like 500 more of exactly those scenes. And the book has this beautiful joy and like whimsicality to it that just did it for me. I ended up giving this 4.5 stars. It was quite close to a 5, and you'll see this more with the rest of the series, but the book is weakest when it's not just about the relationship. When it tries to do too much with the fantasy and the magic system and like the social problems in Regency era England, it doesn't really have a magic system that is meant to make a massive amount of sense. Like, it's really just vibes, and it's best when it stays just vibes and doesn't really have to pass any kind of muster. And same thing with the social critique kind of bent of the book. Like, you just can't fully explore how awful the era was and then also be a silly, goofy romance novel at the same time. You can't do it. And that's okay, that's fine. But it did leave parts of the book feeling a little bit underdeveloped in my opinion. But I still loved it. I loved it. It's super short. It's like 250 pages or something, and it made me feel genuinely like I was frolicking through a field of flowers. So strongly recommend if you're looking for that. As for the rest of the series, they're interconnected standalones, so there's no real through line or spoilers, and you can read them in whatever order you want, although I would recommend reading the first one before the third one, just because you see the characters from the first one a lot more in the third one. This one, 10,000 Stitches, is a very loose Cinderella retelling that's about this girl named Effie, who is one of many maids of this really rich family, and Effie has this massive, massive crush on this guy named Benedict, who has just returned from war? studying? I'm not sure. Those are two very different things, but it's been like almost 2 months, so please spare me. Anyways, she gets the help of this very kind ferryman whose name is Lord Blackthorn, who offers her the ability to essentially put on a glamour that makes her into a society woman, so that way she can properly court him. And the deal is that if she can't win Benedict's heart within a period of like 30 days or something, then she will have to go and be the maid of this ferryman inside of his wood palace. And also she's embroidering his coat, which is where the title comes in. I gave this one 4 stars. I liked it less than the first book. It had a couple more moments that just kind of dragged a bit for me. And also the characters felt a little bit more shallow. Like, I really connected to Dora and Elias in the first book, and it was just not quite the same in this one. I still liked them, but they felt less like complete people to me, if that makes sense. But obviously, despite those things, I still really enjoyed it. I ended up giving it 4 stars still. And the main reason for that is that the whimsicality in this book I thought was even better than in Half a Soul. I think that this was the best of the series in terms of having the fantasy elements be vibes and still be important and meaningful, but they don't really have to make complete sense because they feel good, and that's what matters. It feels like reading a fairy tale in the best way, and they all do, like the entire series, but I think that this was the best of the bunch in terms of that very specific feeling, which did give it more points for me since that's really what I was searching for, just like childlike whimsy and bliss, you know? But the last book, Long Shadow, this one follows the adopted daughter of Elias and Dora from book 1, and she starts investigating this string of disappearances where it seems like young girls are mysteriously dying in the middle of the night, and it seems to be fairy related, and it's very suspicious. And Abigail, the protagonist, has been training with her dad to become a magician, but he doesn't endorse or know that she's investigating these disappearances behind his back, and she's mostly on her own trying to figure things out until she runs into Mercy, who is a street magician that has her own reasons for investigating, and the two of them end up kind of pushed into working with each other, even though they don't get along at first. It's kind of combative vibes from the jump, but obviously it doesn't stay that way as the book goes on. This book was the most mixed of the trilogy for me. I ended up giving it 3.5, and here's why. I still really enjoyed it. Like, I think I would read 300 more books by this author. She could start copy pasting entire sections into new books, and I would still eat it up every single time. I just really love her writing style, and her dialogue is so sharp and fun, and her relationships have such good moments, and all of that was still in here. And I also thought that it was a pretty neat take on a sapphic historical romance. Like, to say more than this is spoilers, but the plot reveal at the end I thought was really subversive and cool, and I found it very memorable. But overall, the plot of this book was just, again, like the series is at its best when you don't have to ask too many questions about what's really going on. And the crux of this one being a mystery, being investigative into the world of fairy, being these two magicians with different vibes of magic working together, it raises so many questions. And the book is like 250 pages and nothing is really substantially developed. And just all of that works a lot better in the periphery of a romance story rather than in the forefront. Because especially in the middle of this, what I wanted was more development in the relationship. And what we got was more investigations into the lore and the world building, but still like not enough for it to feel completely developed and tangible and like a fantasy story. The ending, again, I thought was still pretty good. It had that layer to it that I really liked in the way that everything wrapped up, but altogether it was not my favorite of the trilogy. So that's that. But before we go on to the next book, I just want to mention that I get a lot of questions in my comments about how it's possible to both have such fantastic takes and then also be so hot and cool and interesting at the same time. And it's really difficult work, let me tell you. But one thing that makes it a lot easier is having the confidence of knowing that you smell good, which is why I'm so excited to talk to you about the sponsor for today's video, which is Scentbird. It's honestly very hard for me to capture how much I've always wanted to have a signature fragrance. Like when you're reading and the main character looks at somebody and they're like, he smelled like a long overdue library book, all patience and complexity. Or like, he breathed her in and was transported back to the summer sea at dusk, trawling for crab with his grandfather on coastal Maine. You know, like I want to knock loose repressed memories with how good I smell. That's the vibe that I want to bring to the function. But if you've ever considered really getting into perfume, then you know very well just how ludicrously expensive all of the good ones seem to be. But fortunately, Scentbird is a really great alternative to that not only gets you these little guys, which are these very reasonably sized minis of whatever perfume that you might be looking for. They give you about a 30-day supply, which really gives you plenty of time to decide if you actually like how a fragrance complements your natural scent before you have to commit to a full size. And also, through that model, you have the flexibility to try out a ton of different perfumes if you're interested in expanding your collection. I tend to typically gravitate towards softer and more unisex fragrances just in terms of vibe, and this month I'm trying out 4. First up, we have House of Beau Lamar, which is the super beachy scent. It has notes of jasmine and pink pepper. It's a little bit floral, but it's also oceanic. Like, this is for when you want to smell like beach in the best way. Next up is Commodity Milk, and this one's kind of hard to describe. It's super iconic. It's got notes of musk and cold milk accord, but in reality, to me, what it smells like is powdered marshmallows mixed with my skin, but good and not too strong. It's like your scent, but better. I also have Arquiste Lord de Louis, which, despite having a top note of orange blossom, does not actually smell that directly of oranges. It smells more like orange plants and superiority and being a wealthy French woman taking tea in the garden. And then lastly, I have Glasshouse Sunsets and Capri, which is definitely the most tropical and feminine scent that I got. This one has mandarin, peach, and lily, and it smells to me like the idea of drinking fun bevs on a boat with the girls. If you are interested in Scentbird, you can either use this QR code or click the link in my description, and you will get 55% off your first month in addition to free delivery and a cute case, all for about $8, which is an absolute steal, especially if, again, you're like me and you're risk averse, but you've always wanted to try fragrances. I strongly recommend giving them a try. Thank you again to Scentbird for sponsoring this video. I really appreciate it. Let's get back to it. Okay, welcome back. After that, after the Regency era fairy tale series, I picked up The Many Lives of Mama Love, which is a memoir about a woman who goes to jail because of her opiate addiction and then gets out of jail and recovers from it and deals with all of the numerous obstacles that are along that path. I liked this overall, but definitely not as much as I thought I would. I really love memoirs in general, but especially by women who are beautiful writers and go through very difficult things and come out the other side. That is one of my favorite genres, if that were a genre, and this was that. It was on the list of books in my head that I kind of have pegged as read if you need a 5-star, but I only ended up giving it 4. Let me explain. The writing was really, really good. It was definitely the highlight of the book overall. The author is a ghostwriter for other authors, and you can see why, because she definitely has a really strong command of language. Like, she knows how to do the thing and make the big moment with the big realization hit for the reader. And overall, her story is extremely inspiring. Like, it's not small potatoes to overcome what she's been able to overcome in her life. So I'm glad that I read it for sure. But there were 2 main things I didn't like. And the first is more real, and that is that the book just kind of lacked depth in places. Like, there is so much to unpack with her experiences in the criminal justice system, in recovery multiple times throughout the course of her life, and she glosses over a lot of it. Like, you don't get a particularly strong idea of her history prior to jail beyond random offhand comments that are never really fully explored. And it feels like the reason for this is the author doesn't want to derail this like Hallmark movie style redemption arc with more things that are tough or difficult, even if they're important to understanding who she is. And that's a shame, because the back 25% or so of this book ends up feeling pretty repetitive and self-helpy, and there could have been more meat in other places to prevent that. So that's my first problem. The second is way more subjective, so take this with a grain of salt, but there was just something that rubbed me ever so slightly the wrong way about how she talked about mentoring a lot of the young, mostly Black and brown women in the jail that she was in, and just generally running the blog and being the leader there, because people kind of just defaulted into respecting her since she was so educated and articulate and emotionally intelligent. And the premise of this book is also built on this foundation, right, where she was a soccer mom, she had a master's degree, she was on PTA at her kid's school, and you'd never guess what happened next. She went to jail, but she doesn't look like a criminal, she doesn't look like an addict, which is an important message, because yes, like, you can be addicted to opiates and be all of those things. You can live a white-collar existence and it's not obvious to the outside world what you're going through, and people should know that, because a lot of addicts in this world kind of start off and struggle in silence. But also, at the same time, what do you think a criminal looks like? Because I feel like in establishing this premise, the author differentiates herself so strongly from the other girls in jail, who are often young, dropouts, people of color, repeat offenders, and she builds authentic relationships with them. She clearly cares about them a lot. She tries her best to help them as much as she can. But there is just something subtle in the way that she writes about them, and also in the way that she doesn't really acknowledge how light her sentencing almost certainly was in comparison to all of these women. She had like 32 felonies and only goes to jail for 1 year and then has to do probation afterwards. I can't imagine that there are very many not well-educated white women who received that kind of sentencing. And just the combination of all of that with the premise, I don't know, maybe I'm just kind of jaded and mean, but it read a little bit off to me. Once again though, it's subtle, it's subjective. I honestly feel kind of bad critiquing it. And I still thought it was good and inspiring how she went about her journey and the good that she did and is doing in the world. And it's important, and she should be proud about the positive impact that she's clearly had on so many people. It was a super quick read, it was well written. There were just some subtle things about it that gave me some pause and that weren't explored as well as I wish they had been. After that, I picked up One for My Enemy by Olivia Blake, and this has been on my radar because I think it was Carrie's favorite book of the last year. It was one of her videos, and I had some mixed feelings on this. It got my mixed feeling rating, which is 3.5 stars. This book is a super, super loose fantasy Romeo and Juliet story. I would hesitate to say retelling, because that isn't really what's going on here, but it's definitely Romeo and Juliet vibes for sure. And it is about these 2 magical families inside of New York City, the Antonovas and the Romanovs. And obviously they hate each other because reasons and backstory, but the oldest Antonova daughter, Masha, and the oldest Romanov son, Dmitri, many, many years ago, the 2 of them had this tumultuous romantic affair when they were teenagers, but it could never be because they were from rival families. So they had to break up, even though there was a lot that was left unresolved. And the story follows at once the consequences of that original original relationship in the past between the two oldest siblings, the investigation of a conspiracy where the Antonovas think that the Romanovs are really trying to like take them down for real in magical New York City and are like doing awful things to their business. And then also the youngest Antonova daughter, Sasha, she has just completely randomly met and is now falling in love with the youngest Romanov's son, whose name is Lev, in a way that kind of mimics the path of her older sister so many years ago. So everything in this book is reaching a sort of boiling point as the characters try to figure out what the fuck is going on, what they can do about it, whether it's even possible to heal this like age-old feud, if they even want to, if they should. And it's hard to explain much more than that without spoiling something from early on that is pretty metal and cool. And I think with that, my enjoyment of this book peaked at around like 30 to 40%. When you're meeting all of these characters and getting all of the lore and people are just doing crazy shit all of the time, like it felt like some really neat seeds were being sown for the rest of the story. I also liked the writing in this, which is maybe a controversial take. I don't know if you've ever read an Olivia Blake book, but she has this very particular, like flowery for no reason, constant metaphors that don't completely make sense when you think about them too hard sort of writing style. And I actually really like it from her. It's hard to explain why, because there aren't many authors that could get away with that in my opinion, but it's got this like extremely online kind of guilty pleasure intellectualism to it that I really enjoy. But overall, I only ended up giving this 3.5 stars because the thing about this book is it pretends to have these massively high stakes. But the more that you read in this book, the more that you start to realize that none of these stakes are quite what the author seems to think them to be. And there are two main reasons for that. First of all, I don't really feel like these families had a good enough reason to hate each other like this much initially. Obviously, during this book, that's complicated a little bit. There are some events that make it a little bit more understandable. There are problems between these families, but it's just like all this drama and for what? Like I expected there to be some kind of heavier reveal as to why they've been beefing at such a profound and bone deep level for so long. But eventually I realized that no such reason would actually exist. It just was the kind of thing that the author needed you to accept as true, because if they don't actually have a reason to hate each other, then the story inside of this book completely falls apart. But the other, and honestly more important reason why the high stakes of this book annoyed me is because they're all like completely imaginary. And I can't say much specifically more than that for fear of spoilers, but if you've read this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I was constantly bummed out by how little any of the events actually seemed to live up to the stakes set by the narrative. And you just kind of stop caring when nothing matters like that for such a long time. Like once I realized that none of my world building questions were going to be answered and I was just going to have to coast to the conclusion of this book on like vibes and determination alone, it was just so disappointing because I felt like this story had such a strong start and so much potential that kind of just felt squandered to me. And the ending also was just like, once again, it was just so for the vibes and the aesthetic of it all. No other reason, really, to motivate the characters to do what they do. And just the historic fumble that led to that. The lack of depth was really the weakest part of this book for me. All right, next up after that, I read The Wall of Winnipeg and Me. And this is a TikTok darling. It's also very popular on BookTube. I think the author, Mariana Zapata, is a very beloved slow burn author in the romance space. So I was actually quite excited for this. And to be clear, I always take this vibe of book, like the picked up from self-published and given a cartoon cover TikTok new adult romance. I always take these recommendations with extreme caution. But if you know me, you know that some amount of slow burn is an essential quality for all of my favorite romances in media. I eat, sleep, and breathe slow burn. I dream of it at night. But what I mean when I say I love slow burn is that I love yearning. Like give me an extra serving of we can never be together, and yet you are the person I love, even though I will never admit that even to myself. I want them to brush knuckles in a crowded ballroom like 300 pages into the book in a way that absolutely breaks their brains, because that's the first time that they've ever touched. Like to my absolute detriment, I am a slow burn aficionado, and I still enjoy plenty of love stories that are less slow burn than that, but if you're going to profess to me that an author is the queen of slow burn, I am going to go into that book expecting to be dazzled, and that was not the case with this. The premise of this book is you have this girl named Vanessa, and she has recently quit her job as the personal assistant of Aiden, who is this like giga famous defensive lineman in the NFO, not the NFL, the NFO. But Vanessa quit this job because she kind of just wanted to move on with her life and start her own business, and she's beginning to do that when all of a sudden Aiden, who for context had like barely spoken to this woman during her entire tenure working for him, which I kind of forget the details, but it was at least a year, possibly multiple years. But she knows nothing about this man because he kind of just ignored her the entire time, not out of malice, but just in a I have other shit to do sort of way. But Aiden shows up at her doorstep, and what he asks her could be considered a spoiler since it's not in the back of the book, so I guess this is your warning if you want to skip to the next section, but it's really early on and just kind of the real premise of the book. Aiden shows up and he asks her if she would be willing to fake marry him in the eyes of the US government in exchange for him buying her a house and paying off all of her student loans, which is honestly a deal in this economy, so I don't really blame her for accepting it. But the reason that he needs a fake wife is because he's Canadian and he's scared that he's going to be deported from America, I guess. And I wish I could tell you that this makes more sense later. I wish I could tell you that he had been secretly trying to retire, hence why he needed a marriage visa instead of his work visas from the NFL. I wish that I could imagine, even for a second, a world where a famous NFL player who has been named multiple-time MVP of the entire league, I wish I could imagine a world where that man stood any risk at all of not being able to figure something out other than committing outright fraud. But I can't, because really that's it. That's the reason. There's no more depth to it than that. He's not even secretly in love with her or anything. He just really is convinced that he needs a green card all of a sudden while actively playing football still. And the only way that he can conceive of accomplishing this is asking his vaguely slighted former personal assistant for her hand in marriage fraud. So that's what's going on here. And other than that very basic opening premise, very, very little of substance happens inside of this book. This honestly read like a bunch of completely platonic Herd Comfort one-shots, just loosely strung together with twine until all of a sudden they're in love and it's not platonic anymore. And then they smash in like the last chapter or so, and she calls his a long pipe like she's a fucking plumber or something. I don't know. Basically, this is just 500 pages of girl give us nothing, and it never provided me with the nourishment that I require from slow burn. I need the growing tension. I need the self-hatred and actual real obstacles that prevent you from doing anything about your feelings. Because all we get in here eventually around this point is just the main character being like, oh no, I like him and he has no friends and no girlfriends and only talks to me. But what if my fake husband doesn't return my real feelings? Whatever will I do? It'll be so awful. And like, no, even if she wasn't blind to the fact that he does obviously like her, even if that was not the case, you would still be a homeowner with no student loans, and it would really tangibly change nothing about the situation because you would simply move on. So it was just not real drama to me. I also just hated being in this woman's head. Her subplot genuinely in this book is just out of nowhere training for a marathon despite having never ran before in her life, just to prove that she can, and it never matters and you never care reading this about whether she will succeed or fail. But with all of that said, I did kind of like the man, Aiden, by the end of the book. Look, there's just something about a unit of a dude going, "Don't touch my wife," that will always hit for me. I don't know. It's a microtrope I find to be very, very fun, and he was kind of serving by the end, I fear. But yeah, I gave this 2.5 stars. This actually wasn't as bad as I'm making it out to be. Like, if you just want a book that is pure vibes and nothing else, you still might like this. A lot of people do. I just like it when things happen in the books that I read. Next up, I read the entire Naturals series by Jennifer Lynn Barnes, all 4 books this month. And then there's also this kind of like separate epilogue novella thing at the end of the last book. But in total, it was probably like 1,400 pages, deleted, destroyed. I think that with the stress of moving and just traveling also a bit this month, it was like exactly what I needed at the time. I blacked out and the series was over. This series follows a girl named Cassie, who is recruited into this like super small team of precociously gifted teenagers called the Naturals. And all of them have these special talents that make them extremely useful to the FBI. The protagonist, Cassie, is a natural profiler. So think that one scene from A Study in Pink in Sherlock, but also just in general the series where Sherlock looks at a woman's outfit and her nails and her shoes and just instantly clocks everything about her in her life. That's the superpower that Cassie has. She's like really, really good at cold reading strangers. And the other Naturals, there are 4. One is this emotion reader guy. One of them is a combination human lie detector, but also a master liar. One of them is like a supercomputer kind of eidetic memory or something, fact genius. And then the last one is also a profiler, just like Cassie. And the series follows Cassie and the gang just constantly getting in too deep and working on cases that they really should not be working on, considering the fact that they're teenagers, but they always find the loopholes that let them work on them anyways, so it's fine. And each book kind of has its own main thing going on, but then there's also an overarching plot that ties to the death of Cassie's mother from 5 years prior to the start of the story. There's also a love triangle in this series generally, but I would actually say that it's not that serious because it really only matters for the first 2 books, which is good because it leaves a lot more time for plot, and the mysteries in these second 2 are definitely more complicated as the series goes on. I gave all 4 of these main series books 4 stars. If you, gun to my head, forced me to pick my favorites and rank them against each other, I probably could, but like the way I consumed this series was just a main line directly into the reward centers of my brain. I read them so quickly that it honestly just felt like one long book to me. So that's why they all got the same rating. And I just had a good time. I had a fun experience. I liked the characters. I liked the silly mysteries. I liked the serious spin of this last book in particular. Like, this isn't A1 literature. It's not gonna rock your world. If reading something that is juvenile, it is silly, like These characters are very much teenagers and they act like teenagers. They're really fucking annoying and they do dumb things a lot of the time. And nothing makes sense because obviously teenagers in the FBI, it's not exactly realistic. If any of that is not your style, this is not for you. But if you want to read something that is fun and propulsive and interesting, and especially if your life is really, really stressful and you don't want your books to be, which was kind of the case for me this month, you might have a wonderful time with this. Especially since, in my opinion, the mysteries in here don't talk down to you. Like, they're really interesting all the way through, in my opinion, and pretty well fleshed out for YA. But with that said, I do have a couple of things I didn't like. First up, Sloane, who is the character with the eidetic memory. She's really, really smart. Sloane is beloved in the Goodreads review sections for these books, and she definitely does have her moments, especially in the third book, but overall, I thought that her character felt like the author was just trying to take Spencer Reed from Criminal Minds and make him even more neurodivergent and misunderstood and weird, so random, says the wrong things, does quirky behaviors, and it felt like an obvious caricature in a way that wasn't offensive or anything, but definitely was just kind of cringe. Like compared to Half a Soul, for example, and also a book later in this very wrap-up with much better neurodivergent rep, Sloane just never really feels like a complete real person. Like, she's talked down to a lot by the narrative in this book, and then also in those Goodreads review sections by people who are like, Sloane must be protected at all costs. I will defend my small bean until the day that I die. And it's just like, I just think it's cringe. All because she's just like quirky and says facts at the wrong times when she's anxious, you know? And she has some good emotional moments during the series, but afterwards she will just kind of fall right back into being kind of a caricature again. But I mean, with that said, I still loved the cast. Like, I cried when I finished the last book because of how friends they all were. They found family and they love each other. So it is what it is with Sloane. I just wish that she had more depth to her and less, I just said a fact that I know. Do you want some more facts right now? Should I share some more facts with you? Like she is 90% of the time in this book. Also, my other critique of this series is that this last novella, 12 in the back of Bad Blood, I do not think this needed to exist. I gave it 3 stars because it was fine. I didn't hate it, but like it added absolutely nothing of importance whatsoever. It's really just like an extended epilogue, but there's also a central mystery in it. So you don't actually get a lot of character moments. You're really just getting another mini mystery. And I wasn't like mad when I finished it, but you definitely can just read the main series. You would lose nothing of value. So yeah, that's my take on The Naturals. If you want big brain FBI CW high school drama mystery books, then you're in the right place. After that, or during that, perhaps during some point in The Naturals Odyssey, I picked up The Ministry of Time. This came out a couple of months ago and Haley recommended it in a few of her videos, and I really like things that are genre bending and ambitious and nerdy. And also just this cover is like absolutely gorgeous. I think it's show-stoppingly pretty, which is not a good reason to read a book, but it's a reason. Anyways, the premise for this is kind of hard to capture, but basically you have this girl. Her name is unknown to you. You will never learn it. And she is hired by a government agency to be a liaison for a time refugee inside of this near future version of London. It is this top secret project where scientists have discovered time travel, but they don't know yet what the impacts of time travel will be on the human body. So they go into the past and they take 5 people from different time periods who 100% would have died anyways immediately afterward, whether it's from the Black Plague or war, or in the case of the other main character, exposure from this lost expedition to the North Pole. And they transfer these people to the present day and basically just keep an eye on them in the modern world to see if they like explode and die or if they thrive. And the main girl is assigned Commander Graham Gore, who is a real person from history outside of this book, which honestly I find kind of awesome. There are people in the Goodreads reviews discoursing about whether it's ethical to use a real person like this, and I truly just don't care. Write your self-insert real person fic, queen. Speak your truth. If you want to take somebody who died like 200 years ago and was almost certainly a misogynistic 19th century pig, and you want to give him a redemption arc and make him hot and cool instead, it's not like we really know shit about him anyways, okay? I'm along for the ride. Some people haven't read enough fanfic and it shows. But yeah, all of this to say, the main character's job is to basically just be this guy's bestie as he adapts to the world. And a lot of this book is the slice of life style scenes where the main character is introducing him to things like Spotify or bicycles. And it's so fun, like especially the scenes with just the two of them. The banter is such a good time. But the rest of the book, overall, what's going on is you have this conspiracy, like something mysterious is happening at the Ministry of Time. And the main character is kind of investigating it, kind of avoiding it, like kind of deciding how much she wants to see and how much she is comfortable pretending she does not see. There is a romance subplot going on. And I actually thought for a substantial part of this book in the middle that the romance would be queer between Graham and one of the other time refugees, but I was wrong, I guess. Mostly because the pacing of the main relationship is very much like slow as a snail. Their vibe is very wholesome and platonic. Like the main character has a crush, but she's kind of being a loser about it, which is a big reason why I thought it would kind of go in a different direction. And then very, very suddenly, all at once, they're in love, which brings me to my main problem problem with this book, and that is that I feel like in trying to be everything, this book succeeded in very little, which sounds mean, but let me explain. What I mean by that is if you go into this book expecting a romance, I think you'll be disappointed. The tone of this book, for the most part, is kind of dark, like it's comedic, but it's not super light. And again, the central relationship doesn't have enough romantic development for it to hit particularly hard by the end. It's cute, and again, they have delightful banter and lots of fun scenes, but at least for me, a lot of that worked better in the context of their initial friendship than it did once they had the relationship. Likewise, if you go into this wanting a science fiction story, I also think you'll be disappointed. There were entire portions of this world, and especially of the motivations behind some of the characters, that were extremely hazy to the point of just not really making sense, and there wasn't enough time that was dedicated to building out that world and the impact of the tech, because the book was also just too busy being too many other things. And if you ask too many questions, especially around the climax, you start to see a lot of holes, and you get a lot more from the book if you don't expect it to make 100% internal sci-fi fantasy sense. But at the same time, if you go into this book expecting a thriller, you will also be disappointed. There are definitely a lot of thriller elements in here, like there's some amount of suspense, there's a mystery, it's interesting, you get more questions as you go, but this lacks not only the propulsive pacing of a good thriller, I mean, it really takes its time and chills out during the slice of life sections, and it also doesn't have the unpredictability or the satisfaction of a truly jaw-dropping climax that ties together all of those loose ends that you've been discovering throughout the book. It thinks it has that, but personally, I thought that the foreshadowing around the main twist at the end was like super obvious, even though it was pretty interesting. And more than that, I don't think it was fleshed out well enough to be truly satisfying. So with all of that, what I think this book actually is, behind all of the things that it also wants to be, is a funny, somewhat meandering, but ultimately very heartfelt piece of contemporary fiction that deals with connection, grief, regret, and also just complicity and all of the bad things that happen in the world. The writing in this book is gorgeous. It's got that kind of bizarro, nerd-lit, quirky, verbose, almost for the sake of it sort of style, and there are lots of moments in this book that feel very impactful because of the way that they are written. Listen to this. I had access to his file, as we say. To have access to a file on someone is a simultaneously erotic and deadening experience. When you study a person, as I studied Graham, you enter a pornographic fugue state. All the things that should be intimate become molecular. Their body, which you have never touched, lies against the back of your eyelids every night. You begin to know them, except time always leaves you one moment behind, and so you have to know them more and more, chasing them through time, at the limit where their life meets their future. And you need to have it, 360 degrees of what they see and feel and sense, or else your file is incomplete. Who did they love before you? What hurt them the most? What will cause them the most useful harm? Or this one as well, I think is beautiful. If you were surprised that so soon after a spoiler that I will not read, I was wondering whether the man with whom I'd had sex liked me, remember that being in love is a form of blunt force trauma. I was concussed with love for him. I bent my head to the cudgel. Or this one, I pressed my face against his neck. My body sparked, and I couldn't move it, except to lean into him. I was filled with happiness, so enormous and terrifying, it was as if I'd committed a crime to get it. No one had given me permission to feel this way, and I thought I might not be allowed it. He combed his fingers through my hair, and I was frightened with happiness, harrowed by it. There was no way that anyone could feel this much without also knowing that they were going to lose it. So yeah, I had no idea what to make of this book after I was done. I had to like sit down and talk about it out loud for like 2 hours before I knew how I felt. Just really hit or miss. And for that reason, I don't think I can recommend this to everybody. It's definitely not a crowd pleaser. But if the synopsis sounds interesting to you, if you're not put off by a lack of specific depth, if you're okay with it being a little bit all over the place, give it a try, because I did enjoy a lot of my reading experience. It just became more difficult for me in retrospect once I got to the end and saw how many loose threads there still were. I had the moment where I was like, what was this all for? But I still had a good time reading it, so take that as you will. After that, I read the 4 books for my Mafia romance vlog, and really, what more is there to say about these than what I said in that video? I'm gonna keep this really short because A, it's getting kind of late, and B, honestly, I'm still scarred from that experience, and most of my opinions are the same anyways. So this is the first one I read. It's the only one I own physically. It's Brutal Prince, and this book follows Ida, who is a mafia princess, kind of, but not really, and she is forced to marry Callum after kind of setting his house on fire, among other things. It's a lot. This has your typical dark romance, possessive male lead. It's got the Spitfire, kind of stupid protagonist who never really faces consequences for anything. And really in this book, they just vibe and growl at each other a bit and then smash until eventually they're in love. That's what they do in here. Also, he runs for office. That's like a major subplot. There are some kidnappings. I mean, things happen in this book, but it never feels like things are happening. Like, I don't know if that makes sense. I'm also more jaded now than I was when I initially finished that book in this video. I didn't hate this. I gave it 2 stars. It it read like a book for people who never had a Wattpad phase in middle or high school. The writing and the plot were very much of that era to me. And the book knows it's extremely silly. Like, it's self-aware, but it wasn't for me. It was not my flavor of trashy romance. Next up, I read Den of Vipers, which is my new enemy in this world. And this book is Dad sold me to One Direction, but make it mafia, and then also expand it out into this 650-page odyssey that I went on in that video. This book had, I think, maybe 3 or 4 total plot points in the entire thing, and the rest of it was either these really strange found family scenes that just kind of made me feel empty and cold inside afterwards, or alternatively, the worst written smut that I have ever had the pleasure of reading in my entire life, to the point where parts of it made me wonder, was this written for the bit? Like, was this written with her whole chest or as a work of satire? But unfortunately, I have since discovered that the author has like dozens of other books with names like Gangsters and Guns, Stepbrother's Darling, and Daddy's Angel, so I don't think it's a bit anymore. I think it's quite real. Wading through the mire of this book, I was filled with the bone-deep knowledge just in the depths of my soul that I was reading the worst book that I've ever read or will read, just in terms of craft. Like, it's actually a lot less problematic than some of the other books that I've read and reviewed on this channel, but on a base level, like how it made me feel, the writing, it's the worst one. This is the kind of book that makes you wish that the human race had stopped before we got to cuneiform so that it would never come to this. I have no respect for myself, so I'll probably do a video on this at some point when I'm ready to relive it for some content. For now, that's all I got. I gave this 1 star. I would have given this none star if I could, but I can't, so it gets 1. After that, I read Bound by Honor, which I think if I'd read it before Den of Vipers, I would have given it 1 star as well, but there was just something so transcendently better about this book and the writing than with Den of Vipers that we worked our way up to 1.5, so I'm honoring that for the sake of this wrap up, but this book was not good. Bound by Honor was about this forced marriage between this 18-year-old virginal pure girl and then this 23-year-old violent made man and heir to his mafia dynasty. Fortunately though, he's not physically violent to her, he's only violent to her feelings and to the sanctity of their relationship when, within 2 days of their wedding, he cheats on her with the girl that he told her not to worry about. The only plot of this book, the only through line other than the 90% gunfight with the Russians that happens for reasons that are not described to us, is that the main character, Arya, is a virgin and Luca wants to smash, but like, they can take it slow. She can take her time feeling safe and everything, but like, not really though, because within a week they're smashing and then the smut had the audacity to be bad. So not a good time overall. This one was not it for me. But the last book I read for that video was The Predator by a woman who is only known to the internet as Runix, and I gave this one 2 stars as well because it was not good, but it was my favorite from the video by a lot. And I feel like I'm still too near to the end of that journey to know whether that was only the case because I just come out of reading Den of Vipers and Bound by Honor, 2 books where not a single event occurs. And then The Predator at least had things happening. Like, there was plot, even if it was nonsensical. The point is, I had fun. I said in the video it reminded me of like a really long mid AO3 trashy AU, and that's true. I like things that make me nostalgic for the dumb shit I would read when I was a teenager. I long for the nostalgia of feeling temporarily unburdened by the ills of the world that I have gained as I've gotten older. So props to this for that. But despite and also because of the way that it appealed to that particular kind of nostalgia, the writing in this one was truly something else. Like, it's the writing of the 16-year-old girl in your honors English class in high school who thinks that she's hot shit and like raises her hands every time to read her responses out loud to the rating prompts that they make you do. And you can just tell that every sentence she thinks that she's cooking a soup the likes of which have never been seen before, but really she's just pseudo-intellectual and cringe, but extremely confident about it. And that's what this was. That's what it felt like. So it wasn't good. It never makes sense. The whole plot of this book revolves around Marana, who is a mafia princess and also a master programmer, and she's working with this other mafia guy, Tristan, to try and find these codes that she invented that will bring about the end of society as we know it if they're left unchecked. That's what they're doing for most of this book, at least until they stop doing that and then just stare at each other for the rest of it. And it never makes sense because, like, what are these codes? Nobody knows. What do they do? Couldn't tell you. There is no logic at all to be seen. And yet, for some reason, parts of it kind of hit. So take that as you will. I actually might finish this series someday in the future when I need something that will melt my brain. It's in the back pocket for that. And that is something I cannot say for anything else that I read in that video. But after that, after I was free of that video, unchained by my mafia vlog, I finally picked up The Spirit Bares Its Teeth. Massive tonal shift going from what feels to me like one of the straightest possible romance subgenres to an unapologetically queer and poignant work of historical fiction. But we made it. We did that. This book is is about a trans boy named Silas, who is growing up in 1800s England. Silas is born with purple eyes, which means that he has the power to see and to some extent interact with the world of ghosts. However, because hating women was really popular at the time, and because Silas is trans and therefore seen by almost everybody around him as a woman, he is expected to do what any woman with purple eyes is expected to do, which is basically just shut the fuck up, don't use your powers, and marry somebody of relevance inside of the ghost society, so that way you can have sons, ideally, that have purple eyes and that are allowed to live lives of their own and make decisions with a sense of agency. Obviously, Silas does not want to do this, but not only because he's trans and the idea of being a wife and bearing children fills him with extreme anxiety, but also because honestly, he's just not really that into the whole ghost thing anyways to begin with. What he really wants is to be a surgeon apart from all of this. So when he is betrothed against his will, he tries to like scam the society and run away, but he is unfortunately unsuccessful. And he ends up getting sent to this sort of combination finishing school x conversion therapy asylum x academy x prison, where women with purple eyes who are in some capacity unlikable or rowdy are sent to basically just get their shit together and become ideal wives so they don't like waste their genes and they can pass them down to the next male generation. It's fucked up, obviously, whatever. And the book takes off from there as he's interacting not only with the girls at the finishing school, but also with his suitor who comes to visit sometimes. And soon he discovers that there are ghosts at this academy that are really trying to speak to somebody. And he doesn't really know what the deal is. It's all very dark and mysterious, but something is going on and he has to investigate. I loved this book. I gave it 4.5 stars. We can start there. I was really excited to read this mostly because I loved Andrew's first book, Hell Followed With Us, which I've talked about a lot on this channel, but this one sincerely is so different, I think, in tone, in what it's trying to accomplish. The only thing that those two books really have in common, and it's a pretty big asterisk if you're interested in reading something by this author, but his books do not spare details. They are extremely gruesome. Like in his first book, there's a lot of on-page violence and body horror, and with this one, that's not really the case, but honestly, in some ways, it's even crazier. Like there's one scene in particular where if you are at all averse to medical horror, especially infused with trauma, just really intense stuff described in depth on page, I would look up trigger warning so that way you know what you're getting yourself into. But I'm not gonna say out loud what it is because I like going into shit blind. I'm a crazy person. Nothing will put me off of reading a book and I would rather be surprised. So I'll spare the details, but it is definitely wild. Like it's one of the most intense things I've ever read in a young adult book before, for sure. But even apart from that one scene, because the main character is very fixated on anatomy and surgery, his thought patterns are pretty wild. He'll just be thinking to himself shit like, I thought about what I would look like if I just peeled off all of my skin or something like that, which is a lot if you're not ready. So that's the asterisk on Andrew Joseph White. But to me, not only is dealing with all of that worth it, I actually think it enhances the experience because as somebody who really enjoys horror movies and horror media in general, I think that when horror elements are done right, they do something that no other genre really can. It's terrifying sometimes, even right now, to be a queer person, but especially back then when things were even more awful. Like there are things in this world that you cannot authentically capture without having elements of fear and anxiety and dread in your story. And I think that he does a really good job with this, as well as in his other book. There's also two romance subplots inside of this book that I found to be very tender. They're both definitely a little bit fast-paced just with everything that's going on in this book, but I loved them. I think that they had such great aesthetics, which is a weird thing to say, but specifically the smaller relationship that doesn't involve Silas in this book, if you've read it, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. There's a scene around the climax towards the end that had me gagged just with imagining it like I was watching a movie. It was just like so epic in scope and full of so much love and grief and tenderness between the characters. I loved it. I thought it was really neat. Silas is also autistic in this book, which is a core part of his identity that also touches upon something I think anybody with like multiple things going on inside of their brain has probably experienced at some point, which is that I feel Silas captures the feeling of like chicken and the egg. What is it that did it? Did my autism make me trans? Do I just lack some kind of fundamental understanding of gender in society and that's the reason that I am the way that I am? Or are they completely separate things? Like, can one of them exist without the other? And that particular feeling is very specific to the trans autistic experience, but I also really do think that anybody who has like a lot of comorbid things going on will wonder at some point in their life, like, what is it that did it? What is it that made me this way? You'll have intrusive thoughts like, does my anxiety disorder stem from my ADHD? Do I only have trauma because I was neurodivergent? Am I only queer because of my trauma? And all of that stuff can be difficult to talk about in the real world because you don't want to give anybody else ammunition to weaponize against people like you. Autism causes people to be trans. Queer people are just traumatized. These are terrible chains of thought that you would never use against anybody but yourself, but it's really hard to not use them against yourself at some point in your life when you have a complicated identity. And I really think that that entire journey is handled with so much compassion inside of this book because Silas meets characters who share some but not all of his identity, and by the end he really starts to work through what it means to understand yourself as more than just the sum of those parts in a world that is hell-bent on misunderstanding you, and also just on making it really difficult for you to accept any part of yourself in any capacity. Like, this is a book that, in being extremely brutal, eventually does show you that there is a place for you no matter who you are, and that you can carve out that sanctuary for all of the people that you love. And yeah, I loved it. I would strongly recommend, if you're still interested in this book after everything that I told you about how violent it is, I feel very confident that you will absolutely love it. And if you're put off, on the other hand, by the things that I've said, that's okay too, because Andrew's books are definitely not for everybody, but this is a stan account. Like, I will be first in line to read anything that he writes in the future. I think that he's absolutely brilliant. But on that note, I'm free. I'm done. That's all the books that I have for this video. It's also very late. Like, the sun is almost actively set in the background here. If you haven't already, please like this video. If you don't already subscribe to me, then you should fix that post haste. Tell me all of the thoughts that are rattling around in your brain right now in the comments. I would love to read them. And that is everything. I'm gonna leave. Okay, I don't have anything else to say. Bye.